Hi guys, today we're going to review the properties, and in this lesson you're going to learn how to identify the properties of rational numbers and use them to simplify numerical expressions. And the properties we're going to be talking about are ones that should be very familiar to you: the commutative, associative, identity, and distributive property. Quick review: the commutative property says that I can add or multiply numbers in any order. I can also show this algebraically because no matter what number I plug in for A on the left side, it's the same number I'm going to plug in for A on the right side. And the same goes for B. So whatever two numbers I add on the left side, if I switch the order from A plus B to B plus A, I'm going to get the same answer. And the same applies for multiplication. The associative property says that when I'm adding or multiplying, I can group the numbers in any combination. Notice when I'm using the associative property, I'm not changing the order of the numbers. I'm only changing where the parentheses are. The identity property works two ways. For addition, the identity property says if I take a number and add 0 to it, I'm going to get that number. The identity property of multiplication says that if I take a number and multiply it by 1, I'm going to get that number. So let's look at the examples here and talk about which property is represented. In example A, you might have noticed that the numbers are being regrouped. They're not switching orders. So you're using the associative property. In B, you'll notice that one of the addends is 0. So the number I'm adding to 0 is going to be my sum. This means I'm using the identity property. In this case, it's the identity property of addition. In C, you might notice that the order of the variables, or in this case the numbers, is switched. And when the numbers move, I'm using the commutative property. Let's look at a few more examples. In example A, I might notice that one of the factors is 1. So when I multiply 7 times 1, I get 7. And this is representing the identity property of multiplication. In B, when I have 3 plus 4 on the left side, on the right side I'm switching the order. So I'm using or representing the commutative property. And in C, the order is not being switched. And I'm not only multiplying by 1 because there are 3 factors. So the numbers are being regrouped. The only change is where I'm putting my parentheses. This is an example of the associative property. So let's use the properties to help us simplify these expressions. Let's look at A. 21 plus 16 plus 9. Now, the whole point of using the properties is to make computation easier. I can quickly find an answer by rearranging these numbers. So in this case, I might want to start by using the commutative property. That way, I can get 9 and 21 near each other, because 9 plus 21 is 30, and that's one of those nice round numbers that make it easy to add. So I've used the commutative property to move it around. However, 9 plus 21 doesn't come first in the way that I rewrote it. So if I want to add 9 and 21 first, I'm going to have to put some parentheses around it. And when I do that, when I change the grouping of the numbers, I am using the associative property. Now I need to use the order of operations, and I can do what's in the parentheses first, 9 plus 21, which I easily know is 30. And 30 plus 16 is very easy to do in my head as well. because after I add them, I get 46. Let's look at example B. I have 20 times 9 times 5, and if I do 20 times 9 and then multiply that by 5, I might not be able to get the answer in my head as easily as if I were to switch the order of these numbers. And when I switch the order, I'm using the commutative property. Now, I can also use the associative property if I choose to multiply 5 and 9. Although I would probably use the associative property or just the order of operations to multiply 20 times 5 first to give me 100, and then 100 times 9 to get 900. But let's look at it this way. When I multiply 4 times 9 using the associative property, I get 45. And 2 times 45, I know 20 times 45 is easy because I know 2 times 45 is 90, and then I add a 0. Again, after multiplying, I get 900. Let's simplify a few more. To do this problem, I would want to rearrange the numbers first so I can get that 17 and 3 next to each other. This is an example of using the commutative property. Now, I want to do 17 plus 3 first because that'll give me one of those nice round numbers. So, to group them together, I'm going to use the associative property and then use the order of operations. 17 plus 3 is 20, and 14 plus 20 is 34. In B, I may want to rearrange these numbers once again using the commutative property. And then group 5 and 12, because I know 5 times 12, using the associative property, will give me 60. 3 times 60 is very easy to multiply in my head because all I need to know is 3 times 6. And after I multiply, I know 3 times 6 is 18, and add that 0 to the end to get 180. You can use the distributive property to multiply numbers mentally by breaking apart one of the numbers and writing it as a sum or difference. Now, we've talked about writing it as sums. We've briefly mentioned writing it as differences, but today we're really going to talk a little more in detail about that. And remember, when I use the distributive property, there are two operations: multiplication on the outside of the parentheses and addition or subtraction on the inside. And all that simply means is that I take the number outside, in this case the 6, and multiply it by everything inside. When I do 6 times 9, and then I do 6 times 14. The same rules apply if I am subtracting in the parentheses. I would first do 8 times 5, and since I'm subtracting in the parentheses, I'm going to subtract 8 times 2. And we're going to look at some examples to illustrate this. So if I wanted to use the distributive property to find 6 times 54, I can do it in two ways. I can first do it by adding. So I would rewrite 54 as 50 plus 4. And I would do 6 times 50 plus 4, then use the distributive property to do 6 times 50 plus 6 times 4. Then I would simply use the order of operations and multiply. 6 times 50 is 300. 6 times 4 is 24, and when I add them, I get 324. Let's use the distributive property with subtraction to find the same product. In this case, I'm going to want to find two numbers that I can subtract that are easy to do multiply in my head and will still give me 54 inside the parentheses when I subtract them. So 54 can be rewritten as 60 minus 6. when I write that using the distributive property and multiply 6 times 60 and then 6 times 6 and subtract those products, I would get 6 times 60 minus, or the quantity of 6 times 60 minus the quantity of 6 times 6. When I multiply 6 times 60, I get 360, and 6 times 6, I get 36, and now I subtract to get 324. In both, using either method, I get the same answer. Sometimes addition's going to be easier to use. The addition method is going to make it easier to compute in your head. Sometimes you'll find that the subtraction method might make it easier for you to compute in your head. Let's look at another example. In 8 times 19, I would rewrite 19 as 10 times 9. And so I would get 8 times the quantity 10 times 9. It's just another way to make 19. Then I'd use the distributive property to get 8 times 10 plus 8 times 9. If I use the order of operations, I have to multiply first and get 80 plus 72. And when I add that, I get 152. Let's try to find the same product using subtraction. I would rewrite 19 as 20 minus 1 because I want one of those nice round numbers. So, using the distributive property, I would do 8 times 20 and subtract 8 times 1. Now I use the order of operations to evaluate. 8 times 20 is 160, 8 times 1 is 8, and 160 minus 8 is 152. In that case, I might find subtraction a little easier because I can subtract 8 from 60 maybe a little quicker than I can add 80 plus 72. Now it's your turn. Tell which property is represented for 1 to 3. For 4 and 5, simplify the expression and justify your step by naming the properties you're using. And in 6 and 7, use the distributive property to evaluate those expressions. Pause the video and complete this lesson quiz in the work section of your notes. You can go back and watch any portion of this video or all of the video as many times as you need to. Don't forget to WSQ in your notes.